she will see them in queue and will answer you as appropriate. So it's my pleasure to welcome Alyson Parham Small, your presenter for this workshop. Alyson is the president of Partec Consulting Group. She has numerous years of experience in providing project management, consulting, and other areas of nonprofit capacity building, not just to nonprofits, but to universities. Her experience is very diverse in what she offers to businesses and nonprofits in strategic planning and program monitoring and group facilitation, and certainly in grant writing. Alyson has been successful in helping nonprofit organizations obtain millions in federal government funding from a variety of agencies. As you can see, Alyson's full bio is printed on the screen. And she also is the founder of the nonprofit governmental organization in West Africa, Sustainable Connections International. So with that, we will turn today's webinar over to Alyson. Welcome, Alyson.
Thank you, thank you. So I see folks are still coming on board here. Let's see. I want to make sure that I want to make sure everyone can see the screen. So I'm not sure what happened to the screen. Claudette, if you're there.
Okay. Hi, Alyson. If you just want to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint presentation and show your screen.
Okay. Let's see here. Let's do full screen. Okay. So now that we have that out of the way, so one, I just want to welcome everyone. So we're going to spend a little time talking about, you know, federal grant opportunities and what are some of the things to think about as you consider pursuing some grants. So I've listed 5 things that I hope we will cover today. And let me just say, I know that this is being recorded. I would encourage you to use the chat button if you have questions, you know, as I go through the material. And I know that it is being recorded, so if you need to play it back at a later time, you can do so. So what I'm going to talk about today is just, you know, why even bother to pursue federal grants, and just what I have coined the 4R proposal development process and what that looks like, steps that you need to take to find the right opportunities, what makes a winning federal grant proposal, and then ultimately some tips in preparing a winning proposal.
Hey, Alyson,
so I can hear, yeah.
Alyson, it's Elizabeth. So we're not able to see your screen, and I'm sorry to those of you on our line. So if you could just bear with us for a minute. There we go. All right, thank
One
you.
extra button. Sorry about that. So now hopefully we're all together here. So let me just say that these are the points that I want to cover. I will not be talking about the specifics of how to actually write the proposal. That's just very difficult to do in an hour and a half. But hopefully I'll give you enough information that you can at least start moving towards identifying those right opportunities. And so one of the very first polls I want to take before we kind of dive in here is I just, and Liz, if you can kind of pull it up, I just have a quick poll, and I'm just kind of curious as to how many of you have ever applied directly to the federal government for a grant. And so if you can, your poll is open, and so if you look up at the top of your screen, if everyone can just take a quick second and kind of respond to the poll question, I appreciate it. And then Liz, let me know when when we're good to go.
Okay, so I think everyone has had a chance to answer the question. And based on the responses, we have 67% that have applied directly and 33% that have not.
Okay, well, great. So one more question I want to ask. So whether you have applied for a federal grant or not, I've given at least 4 different categories of challenges that people typically have in preparing a federal application. And so just if you could quickly look at the 4 and to let me know if you've encountered any of these challenges. And then Liz, you can let me know when it looks like everyone's responded. Don't forget, you got to click on the poll.
All right, so it seems that everyone has had a chance to answer the poll questions, and on your screen you'll see the results. We have 50% had pulling collaborators together, and we have a tie at 20% for writing certain sections of the proposals along with preparing the budget, and 10% said other.
Wow, so that is very interesting. I am kind of curious about the other, because I actually had more categories, but I know we were limited to 4. And so what I would say is hopefully we will kind of touch on some of the points that some of you may have encountered in terms of challenges and putting together your federal applications. But again, just really want to encourage you to drop in questions into the chat, and if we have to do an unmute so we can talk, we can do that too, so we can maximize your benefit for this session. So let me just kind of move into why even bother with federal funds, and clearly the majority of you who have pursued federal grants realize that, you know, some of the most common reasons that groups consider pursuing federal grants is really just the size and the diversity of the funding opportunities. When you think about the fact that over $1.11 trillion are given out annually in discretionary grants, which are grants that can go to nonprofits across the country, that's a lot of money, right? And so just the sheer amount of money that's out there, now I'll be honest with you, the good majority of that is actually dedicated to issues around military and security and all of that. But there is actually a healthy size of funding that's available for issues around human services, housing, and community development. Another reason that I find that groups are interested in pursuing federal funds is that it allows for multi-year funding, which for those of you who have tapped into a lot of foundation grants, you know that sometimes it's a challenge, that they typically want to focus on one-year increments. And so the federal government typically can have a grant that can cover multiple years. It also allows organizations to work across the country. And so in winning an award, you are now in a position to network with organizations in different cities across the country that are trying to tackle similar problems. And then lastly, it can help build organizational capacity, particularly as organizations try to specialize in specific areas. Nowadays, as you all know, we are constantly hearing the term evidence-based, and so organizations that are able to participate in federal grant opportunities are often able to build their capacity to then leverage that to talk to other funders about the work that they're doing. But, you know, as I say this, oftentimes I get asked this question around, well, should everybody, you know, just, you know, drop everything and go after federal funds? And I would say that there are some instances where federal funds, and some of you may have found this within your own organization, that it just doesn't work for you. And so I have some examples that are listed. You know, if you're a small nonprofit, you're just getting started, and you want to be the lead, and it's a fairly large grant, as tempting as it may be, it can be a definite challenge, and you can actually be knocked down in points based on your size and the size of the grant. And so sometimes organizations look at federal funding as a way to kind of quickly grow their organization. And as a result, in the past 10 years, where they have found they've made awards to organizations who then couldn't handle the financial responsibility of the funds, so many federal agencies have now instituted requirements to show that you actually have the financial management capacity to handle the grant. And so, again, small nonprofits, great to be a part of a team, may not be ideal for you to serve as a lead. If this is your first time pursuing a federal grant. And the same with startup nonprofits. So again, it's not to say that you can't respond, it's just suggesting that someone else may need to be the lead if this is your first time out. Organizations that have serious financial challenges, a federal grant may not be ideal, just because sometimes there can be some hiccups in the way they pay, although everything is moving, well, is pretty much electronic. But organizations that have some financial challenges, depending on the agency, some require you to show, again, evidence that you have the financial strength to manage the grant, and so that can be a problem. There are other nonprofits who, you know, when you look at a federal grant, they have decided what it is that they're interested in. They're just looking to see who has the capacity and the desire to respond to their request. And so organizations that don't want to follow kind of their guidelines, this is probably not the source for you. And then lastly, nonprofits that don't have any relationship with federal agencies, whether that means you've been a part of a collaborative in the past, or you're not willing to put in the time to develop relationships with federal agencies, which is not difficult to do. All of that would suggest that these are probably the types of organizations that this would be kind of a waste of time. But I want to kind of keep going through to kind of help you to see that at the end of the day, it's really not so much about the writing as it is about making sure that this is really the right fit for your organization. And so one of the things that I suggest to folks if they contact me about writing a federal grant, I've learned over the years that before I jump in and start trying to figure out how to write, I then have to ask them questions about making sure that the organization has the capacity to actually manage the grant. And you'll notice nowadays that in a lot of proposals, requests for proposals, they will specifically ask questions around staff expertise, the financial management systems, reporting and tracking, who are your collaborative partners, and then ultimately your relationship with the community. And so if you are responsible for writing proposals to the federal government. I would say that these 5 bullets increasingly have much more weight, even beyond your traditional methodology, because what federal agencies want to ensure is that they have the right partners who can deliver based on what they've identified in the RFP. And so again, as the grant writer, you kind of have to, if you've not ever pursued a federal grant before, you want to kind of understand what are those systems in place. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the collaborative partners, because that can be extremely helpful. But just to make sure your organization has a response to each of these bullets as you respond to the RFP. Now, again, as I go through this, if you have questions around any aspects of, or have thoughts or things that you want to share, please, send us a note in the chat so that we can kind of talk about it. So one of the areas I often find when groups are interested in pursuing federal grants, they start with the size of the grant award, and they're excited about that. And so then I try to move them back to make sure that the opportunity really matches the need and capacity in the community. And so when you think about the need, as the organization, if you are the lead, it becomes really important that you are able to articulate what are the real conditions in the community, whatever that community may be. Now, the community can be geography bound, or it could be a specific population, but you have to demonstrate that there is truly a need based on however you have defined the community. At the same time, the need is not only being able to articulate the conditions in the community, but it's also about what are some of the gaps in responding to those conditions. So what are some of the things that are not happening in order to effectively meet the needs of the community in which you seek to serve? Now, while tempting as it may be to want to use this as an opportunity to kind of bash other organizations or institutions, it's not necessary in a federal grant, but it is necessary that you are able to articulate that there really is in fact a need that matches up with the opportunity. So for example, I had an organization once that I was reviewing a proposal. It was a federal proposal, and they claimed that there was a critical need for this particular grant because they claimed that there was high levels of crime in their community. And as you read on, and then they made the huge mistake of putting in a chart, and the narrative talked about all of the demographics of this community, and they kept referencing high crime. And then they went on to talk about that there was, over a period of 3 years, a 300% increase in crime. Now, anyone who's reviewing a proposal and you see a 300% increase, that obviously says, wow, we really have a serious issue. But in this case, the organization then went on to include a chart to depict what they considered to be the 300% increase in crime. And the chart consisted of year 1, there was 1 homicide, year 2, there was 1 homicide, and year 3, there was 1 homicide. Now, had they stopped at the 300%, it probably, some reviewers might have said, wow, that's sufficient justification. But because they kept going, one, it just was clear that there was no high crime. Clearly there was crime, but there was not high crime. And so it then made it an issue relative to this particular opportunity because the opportunity said you must demonstrate high crime. The other piece that goes along with making sure that there is a real match is around the capacity. And again, if it's an organization that's trying to go solo, when clearly there is room for collaboration with other organizations, that represents a challenge. And for reviewers, the question becomes, why isn't this organization collaborating with other organizations? And then it also raises a question around, so does the organization have all of the capacity needed to carry out the work? Now, yes, there are a lot of grants in which the organization may reference other organizations, but they're not listed as part of the budget in a federal grant. But the idea of being able to tell the story of not only the organization and its capacity, but also demonstrating that it knows how to play nice with other organizations who do different things in the community, demonstrates a more comprehensive look at capacity. So we have to be clear that there is truly a need in the community, and that there is capacity both in terms of the organization and or collaborative, and that it's the combination of the two that then matches with the opportunity for the a federal request for proposal. And so I want to stop here real quick just to do a check-in to see if anyone has questions on what I've covered already. And if so, you could drop something in the chat, or we can unmute the line. Okay, well then I will keep rolling here. So I just really want to kind of close out this piece around need, just to make sure we're all clear about what is an unmet need. Keep in mind, when the government is issuing a request for a proposal, they have determined that there are conditions around the country that warrant some type of intervention. And if you've spent any time looking at an RFP from the government, they've become very, very detailed, which means really what they're looking for is the provider to address what they have determined to be an issue. And so when we talk about an unmet need, we want to make sure that we're thinking about something that builds upon an existing model. And so again, you'll hear a lot of language. There's always this constant discussion around evidence-based or promising practices. So it's something that has been proven successful in another environment. And so the question is, can you apply that in your community? Sometimes an unmet need is just the need to expand programs or services to serve more people or more subsets of people. There could be a new approach to solving what appears to be a chronic problem, or the desire to transfer something successful into another community or location. So say, for example, if you're working in one neighborhood in Chicago and you've decided that what has been working is now something that could be transferred to another neighborhood. As long as there is a need for that and you have the data, again, this is federal government will be a great opportunity to pursue. What I would say, and you'll see it in the language in federal requests for proposals, that if the issue of the day is really that you have a grant that's expiring and you're just trying to figure out a way to retain the staff expertise, while that's clearly a valid need of the organization, it doesn't really match with the federal government and what they have defined as a need. And so the need has to be driven towards the communities in which you serve. And so having said that, whoops, sorry about that. One of the ways in which you can be clear on whether there is a need is by looking at a lot of secondary data, reports and studies, census. A lot of times people are tempted to use news articles, and let me just say this about news articles. Sometimes I discourage people from using news articles as a major source of information for their proposals. The reason being is that sometimes reviewers feel like news articles have become increasingly slanted versus one political party or another, or just no longer objective. And so what I encourage people to do is that if you find a great article, now if it's an article about your organization, definitely go for it, right? But if it's an article in general about conditions in a community, you may want to kind of drill down a little deeper to look at the sources that whoever wrote the article used, and then to double check to make sure that those sources really do validate that there is in fact a need, instead of having a lot of citations of news articles. The other thing that I think groups can do to really kind of diversify themselves as they begin to talk about the need is to look at ways in which you can either do, if there have been focus groups or discussion groups that you did not lead, and there was results from those discussion groups or town hall meetings, those are great resources that one can use, again, to kind of confirm that there is a need. Lastly, I would say that primary data. So again, if you are working with the population, if you do any kind of surveying of clients, that's always really great information, because, you know, where the federal government, different agencies will do these national surveys, there are times when the results of national surveys don't really kind of match up to what's happening in a specific community. And so whenever you have data from your community that you've collected, that's going to trump some of the national surveys where things kind of, you know, kind of even out as you look across the country. So again, really want to encourage you to think about quick ways in which you can gather information regarding your clients, and then just the analysis of that data. And again, I'm not suggesting that you have to go out and do this extensive surveying of all of your clients to gather a lot of information. It could be something very specific to opportunities that you're considering. But the idea is that at the end of the day, you have to be clear that what you're pursuing is really a need and not kind of a want. Because as you begin to drill down into some of the other kind of federal opportunities, you'll find that they will begin to ask for justification for why, in fact, you're saying something is a particular need. The other piece then is around organizational capacity. And again, for a federal grant, oftentimes organizations are going to have to scale up in order to deliver the services, and federal agencies understand that. But what they're looking for is whether the organization has staff expertise in the general area of work. And so, can you say anything about the track record of the staff? Can you say anything about the organization's ability to hire people, whether it's you're hiring staff from the community, whether you are hiring or working with other nonprofits who are going to be defined as subcontractors in order to carry out the work. And then even as you think about some of your collaborative partners, you can begin to think about, is there something that they bring that's complementary to your organization that is going to kind of round out the package of the staff expertise? And so one of the things that I often suggest to groups is that you prepare a matrix that basically identifies what are some of the top skills and expertise and educational backgrounds of the individuals that will be participating on the grant. And then it can help you identify whether there's some gaps, you know, that may need to be addressed in one way or another. You just want to be mindful that you can't have staff that exceed more than 100% of the time. And so there's always language that is a definite no-no. Anything that references that comp time is a definite no-no on a federal grant application. You have so many hours in a year, and people are either billing to other grants or other projects, you know, or they have time that can be billed towards this project. And so you want to make sure that you have a team that's actually available time-wise to carry out the work. The other thing is that you want to make sure that the organization has proper systems in place, whether it's the financial and the technical capacity. Sometimes federal agencies have started to ask for information around the credentials of the people who will be handling your financial management system. They want to know, is it done in-house? Is it going to be done externally? What's that relationship like? Is it something that you bid out on an annual basis? And so just being clear about the capacity of the organization to carry out the work is something that you want to think about before you actually begin pursuing the opportunities, just so that you don't spend time chasing something where the organization didn't have what it takes to be successful. I believe that when we think about going after grant opportunities, that there's what is called a 4R pursuit. And it's research, relationships, responding, and rewards. And so a lot of times groups, when they call and they say, hey, I've identified a grant, can you help us write it? And then I ask the question, when is it due? And it's like due in a couple of weeks. Well, you know, the reality is that federal grants work in pretty much the same cycle year in, year out. And at the point that you're within 30 days of preparing a response, some will argue that that's not enough time to put together a solid proposal. Now, if it's a proposal you've written before, yeah, you probably can do it. But if it's a completely new agency, you really just kind of want to think about the timing of the proposal and who's going to be available to help. Sometimes a lot of organizations, it comes down to one person, so you have to figure out if there are other things on your plate. But what I suggest to folks is that it really starts with research, moves to relationships, and then the responding is the actual writing of the proposal, and then the rewards is your notification. And so I want to kind of spend our remaining time kind of giving you some things to think about relative to this process, and we'll go from there. So you're interested, you've received HUD funding before, now it's time to look at some other agencies. Well, where do you look for the opportunity? So if you've not spent any time in the past, let me just say that the one nice thing about the federal government is that all of the information is now available online, and it's just a question of, do you have the time, or can you dedicate someone to kind of do this research up front? The main source is grants.gov. You can also go to CDFA, did I say that right? CFDA.gov, which will give you pretty much the same information from grants.gov, but in kind of a different format. And then there's some general information on nonprofit.gov, which are all great resources for you to check out when you have time. And then obviously agency websites will give a lot of information. Nowadays they're all kind of catching up to the system, and so they keep deferring everyone back to grants.gov. But those are the online resources that one would look for. Now, and I'll show you real quick and then I'll bounce back to this. So this is an example of grants.gov. If you haven't spent any time on this page, I would definitely encourage you to do so. It has a ton of information. You'll see here that they have a blog. There's just a tremendous amount of information, and sometimes it can actually send you into overload. But it pretty much is kind of the one-stop shop if you are interested in pursuing federal grants. But let me jump back here for a second, because even as you kind of scroll through and you try to identify opportunities that you think may be appropriate, what's going to happen is that you're going to identify opportunities that may be coming up, but in reality, it may be too late. And the reality is that the government ends on September 30th. That's the overall year for the federal government, so it'll start over again October 1. But what I find is that a lot of organizations want to pursue grants and they want to do it all online, and they just want to respond. And let me just suggest to you that along with the research, there's relationships. And so I would definitely encourage you, if you are interested in reaching out to some other agencies where maybe your organization historically has not gone before, is that it's important to really talk with agency program staff. These are the individuals that are responsible for managing the grants, often in terms of crafting requests for proposals. And so they have a wealth of information, and they can either help you figure out whether it is even worth your while to even pursue grants that they have available or not. The other source is to talk with your political representatives. A lot of them have individuals on staff that can give guidance around what they have heard is coming down the pipe. They also want to know what nonprofits in their area are thinking about, because, you know, a lot of times groups are going to reach out and ask for support, and the worst thing that can happen is that you have multiple agencies applying for the same grant for the same community. And so staying connected with political representatives can be extremely important, so that you kind of can know what's happening, what's being talked about in Washington, what have you. You also may want to network with other organizations, although we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to collaboration. But all of this is happening outside of your general grant writing season. And so it's very difficult to try to hop onto this website, start scrolling down for an opportunity and go, oh, here's one and it's due in, you know, in 15 days, let's go for it. What I recommend to folks is that, well, let's take right now. It's at the end of the year. Now may be a good time. I normally recommend to folks that the summertime is a great time to do research for potential opportunities. And what you will see is that you can search by category, by agency, by eligibility. There's so many different ways in which this information can be cut for you. And what you will find is oftentimes it will pull up notices for opportunities that have passed. And so before you get kind of sad about that, just remember those same opportunities are going to come up again. And so what you want to do is to take note of what were the requirements in those notices so that you can begin gathering the information and you'll be in a ready position when it comes out again. Most federal grants, discretionary grants, typically come out around the same time every year. Now, next year, because we're moving, you know, we'll change administration. It's possible that some things get pushed off a little bit, but for the most part, federal grants typically come out around the same time every year. And some agencies make very little to no changes to their solicitations. So very important that we spend some time on grants.gov if you're looking at federal grants. I don't know whether we can do this or not, but I'm just kind of curious how many of you spend time doing research on grants.gov. Maybe if you could just put in the chat box. We don't have to do a formal poll. If you spend time doing research, if you can just type in a yes in the chat box, that would be helpful. Okay, and so Liz, for whatever reason, it's not going to let me see anything. So if it's showing on your end, if you can let me know.
Hi, Alyson. So yes, we have Jackie Edens that said yes. Blake said yes as well. Corinne said 0 time. Sarah Jane said receive daily email updates from grants.gov, sorry. And Michael said yes, I do research.
Okay. Well, and as you know, the research can be a royal, pain sometimes because it's not like you don't have other things on your plate, right? And so one of the things that I would suggest is if you think about what I mentioned earlier in terms of the need and the need for the population that you seek to serve, this can be a great project to assign to a college intern. And all you're doing is you're giving them the parameters to do the search under grants.gov. So you may say, we're interested in grants that are going to target maybe young people, maybe families, whatever you decide are the parameters. And they can literally kind of put in those keywords and it will run a search. Now, if I'm doing a search for an agency, I typically will identify what federal agencies I think are a better match. So I'm not spending time because literally you can get into all the international stuff and, it can be a waste of time. But I would suggest that this could be a great project. All you have to be able to do is to give the parameters for whoever's going to do that research for you, and you just kind of let them go at it, and they literally can kind of come up with a table in terms of what's the opportunity, what's the title. They can actually pull up old solicitations. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but you definitely want to capture information in terms of the typical size of the award, whether it's a multi-year award, anything in particular. Definitely want to find out if there's a contact person for that agency so that you can begin to do the follow-up. I have had instances where I've gone to Washington with clients and they've sat in front of the program staff, and just the level of information that they're able to get, we are always able to integrate that into the proposals, and so they begin to stand out. So whatever you can do relative to research is going to be extremely helpful to you at the point that you get to the writing. So I've just kind of given you some of my kind of key features about grants.gov. And as I said, you can check opportunities in the future. You can pull up past solicitations. You can sign up for the email alerts, although if you haven't done so, you want to be mindful because sometimes they can go into overload, particularly when they're in the midst of their season. So you really want to be clear about who it is that you want to get solicitation or the notices from. If you want to shore up your skills in grant writing, they have information on their site. And then ultimately, this is the portal in which you will actually submit your proposals. So you want to kind of play around with all of that well in advance of an opportunity. Because of the population that I understand most of you serve, here are the federal agencies that I would suggest if you're going to do some research that you may want to kind of concentrate on. Now, obviously, I think most of you have received HUD funding at some point, but Health and Human Services would probably be my next choice in terms of an agency that actually has programs that specifically deal with homeless populations. And then I would move over to the Department of Labor. So it's HUD, Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, and then a Department of Education could be what I would see as the 5 top agencies. Now, within each, overall agency, then they've got, their respective units. And so, again, you have to kind of drill down a little bit. But I would actually probably, if I were going to number these, I would put them in this order. So if someone was going to do some research, if you exhausted all that you feel like you can do for HUD, I would definitely move into looking for opportunities out of Health and Human Services. and then Department of Labor, and then so forth. Just so that you're not spending time on areas where it may seem like it's a fit, but it's so far removed from what you're currently doing that it may be somewhat of a waste. Once you've identified some of the opportunities, and I'm going to assume that hopefully some of you will consider using like an intern to help collect some of the information, some of the things that you want to know is just, are we really eligible to apply? Sometimes it can be a little confusing as you're reading the instructions because there are grants that are specifically state agencies are the ones that they're looking for, or city agencies, and so your organization is not eligible to apply. You want to find out as much as you can about the agency that's issuing the award, the notice, just to kind of see what other kinds of grants maybe they've issued in the past. You can also get information in terms of who are the past award recipients. And so one of the things that I suggest is that you can go on to a federal department's website, and literally there's a link that will talk about grants, and typically they will then tell you about the awards that have been made. And you can literally scroll by state, and you can kind of see who's gotten what awards and what categories, and so it gives you a lot of information in terms of who's getting what. You also want to be conscious about how much money is available. If there's a solicitation, and let's say they're only putting a couple $1 million out, and maybe they're only going to give out about 10 grants, and it's a national award, well, then you have to kind of decide that's really not a lot of money. And if you don't have a relationship, is this really the best match for your organization? Are there some geographic restrictions? Can you meet the deadline? And then are there other specific requirements associated with the grant that your organization may not be able to address? Again, these are kinds of questions that you want to ask yourselves before you begin to write, so that you don't spend time writing on opportunities that aren't going anywhere. I have what I call the 80% probability rule. If you don't think that your organization, when you look at all of the requirements associated with preparing a response, and you look at how much time you have available, if you don't feel in your gut that you have at least an 80% probability that you can be successful in the award, then my recommendation is to pass, and don't waste your time on it. Because no one gives you brownie points for just submitting a lot of proposals that aren't going anywhere. You might as well invest your time and your resources on opportunities where there's a clear match. And so it's that critique of not only the solicitation but your organization's capacity that helps you kind of determine whether this is something you really should drop everything and invest your time and energy on, or whether it's something that you should pass. So just to make sure everyone is clear that the federal budget year goes from October 1 to September 30th. And most grants, so October 1 is next week. And usually a lot is not happening there, but you will see some notices that will come out before the end of the calendar year. Most of the grants start rolling out after the new year, and that's when things really start to get crazy. Some federal agencies, if you spend time looking on their websites, will give you kind of a sense of what they're planning on releasing so that you can kind of get ready. There are some, HUD is great for this, that do the supernovas, that are big solicitations that have a lot of different components to it. And so you want to kind of check that out. I find that between the months of July and September 15th, the announcements begin to slow down. And part of that is because the federal government, they have to have any solicitations that they issue, typically all of the paperwork and everything has to be done by September 30th. So a lot of groups try to get their solicitations out well in advance, because it usually takes them about 120 days to process all of the proposals they've received. So that's why this July to September is always a great period just to do your research in preparation for the next year. And that way you can kind of figure out if you missed the window this year, you'll know in advance when it generally is going to come out again, and you can kind of plan your strategy well in advance for the next year. So I want to take another stop real quick to see, are there any questions? So again, for whatever reason, I'm not able to see the chat. Maybe I've clicked something wrong. So Liz, if you see if there are any comments in the chat box, you know, if you can let me know. But
yeah, hi Allison, this is Liz. Unfortunately, we don't have any questions. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in your chat box, and we'll gladly share them with Allison so she can give you an answer right away.
Okay, well, we will keep moving here. So one of the things about federal grants is around the relationship issue. So I talked earlier about making sure that you can establish a relationship with the federal agency before you actually prepare the response. But now I want to talk about relationships relative to collaboration. So, you know, within the last, I would say, 10 years, federal agencies have tried to do more mirroring of collaboration. So they always put it in their proposals, but federal agencies historically have not collaborated well. They very much function in silos. And so now they're trying to do this a little differently, just because they really believe that collaboration is the way, but, you know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I just wanted to remind folks that the collaboration can be a tricky issue when there's money on the table. And again, for federal grants, money is usually pretty large. And so what I would suggest is that as you begin to think about your collaborative partners, now there's two types of partners, if you will, that your organization may use in a proposal. One is a collaborative partner who will actually be written into the proposal and is considered a subcontractor, so they'll be financially compensated for the expertise that they bring. To the extent that you, and then there are partners, community partners, who are not going to be financially compensated, but are organizations that are out in the community that provide services that just kind of show a strong connection of resources for the population that you seek to serve. It really is important, and I've reviewed proposals, and even as I've written proposals, one of the areas where proposals begin to break down is really around collaboration. Part of it is that you have to make sure that every partner brings something to the table. And the worst time to try to figure out who your collaborative partners are is at the point that you're actually writing a response to an RFP. And so, again, if you can kind of imagine, if you've done the research well in advance, you know what it is that you're going to be looking for even before the solicitation comes out. You now can begin thinking about who are the right partners that you should be working with. And it could be that some of your partners are your current partners, or maybe you're going to have to go out and form some new ones. It gets a little tricky because you have to have open communication regarding what it is that you're proposing, and so and a level of trust. And so part of this is not only partners that are going to be involved in possibly writing the proposal, but you have to have the right partners who are prepared to carry out the work consistent with the same values of your organization. And you're going to need partners that are prepared to kind of balance the exposure. So everyone is not going to be, you know, the top billing entity. It could be that you identify an opportunity that ultimately your organization may not be the prime, but could be literally another subcontractor. And that's okay, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about meeting the needs of the community. It's not just about your organization. But the other attributes of a collaboration is that there has to be a commitment to this transfer of knowledge in terms of what are we learning from the work that we're engaged in, and how are we using that information to achieve a greater impact on the individuals that we serve. So again, I always suggest that collaboration start well in advance of responding to an RFP. And you may want to start thinking about forming or writing a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement. And let me just say, there are times in which there are some folks that you're going to need to avoid. And so if organizations that you are interested in collaborating with want to work with you, but they're not open to signing an MOU or an MOA, and if you don't have those kind of templates, if you Google nonprofit MOU, MOA, you literally can pull up samples of generic documents that you can use and kind of modify. But there are some folks that you may want to consider avoiding. One group are individuals or organizations that have had a poor track record in managing other grants. Okay, whether it's a federal grant, a state grant, if there have been some issues with that organization, that's one that you want to kind of, draw a red flag. If the organization doesn't have someone that is committed to working alongside you as you're trying to design a response to a proposal, again, that's something that you have to call into question. And you want to see where the commitment of the organization's leadership, meaning the board, is relative to the organization. And so you do want to kind of ask some questions. The questions you want to ask yourselves is, do we know who serves on the board of our potential collaborating organization? Are there some rumblings in the community about the organization? If it's an organization that has made front page news because of something they've done that was not positive, that's probably not an organization that would work well in your application. And it's something for you to think about. You also want to ask questions of your collaborating partners. And you want to ask questions like, what's been your experience on a federal grant? I've worked with organizations that have learned the hard way that while people get excited about the money, they don't have the capacity to carry out the work. And if you're the lead and you're now responsible for these other partners and they don't carry out the work, the feds come back to you, not to the partners. So you do want to ask them some questions. You want to ask questions if they've ever defaulted on a federal grant. And then you want to ask the really tough question, and that is, if you're doing it in the midst of an actual solicitation, you want to know whether the organizations you're working with are also working with other groups to prepare a response. And unfortunately, I've had groups who have sat at a table with a group of organizations and literally found out later that all of the design work from their meeting was then carried to the next meeting to help another group put together a response. And so because of the level of time and effort that goes into putting proposals together, I would definitely recommend that you ask this question of groups. And sometimes you just have to say, you know what, maybe another opportunity. If they're not willing to kind of work just with you and they're on other teams, that typically is not a good sign for your organization. So let's assume now that you've had conversations, you've identified. Yes,
So we have a question for you through the chat box. Jacqueline asked if your program shows a deficit on their financials, what are the chances of getting funded?
Well, so with the federal government, if it's the agency itself, people know that organizations sometimes run a deficit, so it's not the worst thing in the world. The question is more so the size of the organization versus the size of the grant. So let me give you an example. If the organization has an annual budget of, say, $50,000, okay, a very small organization, and the grant opportunity is about $1.5 million, okay? Some federal agencies, they don't catch it until much later, but some agencies will stop right then and there and say this organization does not have the capacity to manage a $1.5 million grant. And so they're trying to mirror foundations a little bit, that they don't want to put organizations in a position that they truly just can't manage that level of money. If an organization is running a deficit, it's just a question of how long and why. But that usually is not, as long as there is consistency in terms of the size of the grant versus the size of the organization, that typically is not a concern for government. It may be more so for foundations, but government, they just want to know, can you do the work and can you get us the reports on time? So I would not discourage people from doing, responding unless there are some other issues regarding your finances that are at play. Okay? So if you've now done your research, you've narrowed down some opportunities, you've talked to the program staff, and you feel pretty confident that you're in the right space with the right concepts to address the need. You've identified the right collaborating partners. Now we get to the responding. And so again, the responding is the actual writing. And so while I don't have time to talk about the actual writing, some of you are more than welcome. I will teach a course in DC for groups who have done writing on federal grants, where they go through and they can critique their own work. It's an intermediate level course for NavalWorks America. But let me just suffice to say that good proposals for federal, in response to federal opportunities, they take time. You will find solicitations where the language is messed up. It looks like they cut and paste from old solicitations and they didn't read it carefully. So it can be kind of a royal pain to kind of figure it out. You will find that you can write a great proposal and it still doesn't win because of other kind of features that federal agencies have about making distributions of grant awards. But ultimately, federal grants are based on who has the ability to follow the instructions. I have reviewed federal proposals, and typically the reason that groups are declined is that they just fail to follow the instructions. And so let me just say that if I were to encourage you to think about, even for those of you who have written federal proposals before, now there are proposals and there are agencies that are accustomed to getting proposals from groups, but if you're looking at crossing into agencies where you haven't had that kind of relationship, let me just suggest to you that some of the most powerful sections beyond the methodology is really based on the need statement. And this is definitely the case if you are looking at funding from Health and Human Services. The need statements matter. They want documentation, they want you to cite your sources, and they expect you to not only pull local data, but compare it with national data. It's quite extensive. So you want to make sure that the need statement really supports your understanding of what's going on in the community. The budget. Although it seems fairly simple, I've watched groups lose points and lose the award because the budget did not tell the same story as the narrative. The logic model. A lot of federal agencies are now requiring the use of logic models. And again, if you're not comfortable on how to put together a logic model, if you literally Google sample logic models for nonprofits, there are YouTube videos, there are all different kind of tools out there to help you to put together a logic model for your particular program. And then the last thing I would say is don't underestimate the attachments that federal agencies will ask for, particularly when they start asking for either letters of support or memorandums of understanding. And so let us be clear that what federal agencies do not want are letters from organizations that say things like, we just want to support this organization and we hope that you will give them funding because they do great work in the community. That used to be a letter that was helpful. Today it is not. They want letters of commitment, which is basically saying, our organization is committed to providing X, Y, and Z to work alongside whoever is the lead organization to carry out the work. And a letter of commitment is very similar to a memorandum of agreement, if you will. And so it's just a question of which one can you do in the fewest number of pages. And then I would suggest that you also share your results with your political folks before you submit the proposal. Oftentimes I find that people are submitting proposals and they never tell their political folks that they're submitting it, only to find out that you're competing against each other for the same opportunity. And so if you have the opportunity to sit with some of these folks before you respond, that would be ideal. It helps them to kind of keep track of who's going after what, and so they can kind of track what the proposals as they kind of go through the process. Okay? And so what makes a winning proposal? So let's assume that you're able to do what I consider to be the two requirements to being a great grant writer. One is your ability to write a sentence, and the second is your ability to follow instructions. When you look at what makes a winning proposal, you do have to provide solutions that are relevant to whatever is the problem. And you have to know that your solution has been kind of vetted in a way that shows that you've looked at other practices that are out there, and you either are adding to that practice, you're offering an alternative that has some justification as to why your alternative may work. It effectively quantifies and qualifies the objectives. Typically in a federal proposal, they will ask you for specific objectives that you hope to accomplish. Many of them now actually give you the objectives, and so you just have to kind of give it back. That you have the right management team, you have a sound evaluation plan, and let me just say this. If you are looking at if you're looking at a grant that is coming from Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Department of Education, and even Department of Justice, when you start getting up in the large grant, $250,000 and up, and they start talking about evaluation, it may be time to think about a third-party evaluator, okay? And as you think about this individual, keep in mind that their credentials will be vetted, and if I were you, I would ask whoever it is that is going to write, to actually do the evaluation, to write this section of your proposal. Because this is one area where if you don't really understand evaluation language and you just kind of think you can kind of fake it, because of who today federal governments have as reviewers, they will catch it. And you'll lose points. So let whoever is going to do the evaluation write that section. You want to make sure you have a realistic timeline. Even though your proposals will be uploaded as a PDF, you do want to make them appealing and pleasing to the eye. Remember that the reviewer is looking at a lot of proposals that look the same, so anything that you can do to kind of break it up, I'm going to give you some tips in a minute, but you do want to make sure it's pleasing to the eye and that the work is consistent to the organization's mission, and that you really are kind of highlighting your collaboration and the fact that you're leveraging resources. These are the areas that really kind of make a winning proposal. And so what you have to do is kind of go back, look at proposals you've written, whether they won, they didn't win, to kind of see whether you could check off all of these little bullet points. Let me just make sure I tell you quickly about how proposals are reviewed, because what I find is that if people understand how they are reviewed, it may give you insight in terms of how to kind of package your proposal. So most federal agencies will put out a call for external reviewers. So they usually put together a team that consists of someone from the outside as well as some people from the inside. In fact, some of you could sign up to be a reviewer on proposals given your expertise, and you get paid. They then provide an extensive checklist. And just to give you an idea, if you're putting together a 20-page proposal, The checklist that a reviewer may use could be 30 pages or more. It's very detailed, and it requires that they have to really document where they found information in your proposals. And so sometimes just serving as a reviewer can help give you insight in terms of ways to strengthen your own writing. After they have scored your proposals, then the reviewers participate on a concurrent call where they're kind of looking at all the scores, and people have to justify why they gave a proposal a particular score. The agency leadership ultimately gets the scoring. They may make modifications based on you know, some latitude that they have in terms of looking at geography, looking at if there are areas in the country that seem to have a need and they didn't get a lot of responses. So they can make modifications to the final ranking, and then ultimately the top groups, group or groups are awarded the grant. But what I would encourage you is that if you are serious about going after federal grants, one, I would definitely look at on the websites of the federal agencies about signing up as a reviewer. And you can kind of troll the internet. There are some examples of checklists, and you can kind of look at that to see the kinds of questions. But in the back of each solicitation, when they give you a section that talks about what criteria they will use to review your proposal, that I use as a checklist. So it just says criteria used in scoring, and I use that to say, did I cover all of these points? Because in one way or another, that's what they're going to use to come back and to score your proposal. Okay? Proposals that fail really is because people just didn't read the RFP carefully. They didn't include the right documents. I have actually been on a review where people uploaded the wrong proposal. So they created like an outline, saved it as the same name as the final file, and then they uploaded the outline. So you believe it or not, it happens a lot. So you want to make sure you actually send the right proposal. Other reasons why federal proposals are declined is that it was just the writing styles are very different, particularly when you have multiple people writing sections, which I kind of discourage because people write differently. That there's insufficient justification for the need. The lead organization really doesn't have the qualifications necessary to kind of lead a collaborative. And then the last one is that the budget fails to align with the narrative. So one of the recommendations that I give groups is that I start with the budget first. Assuming that you're going to get whatever is the amount of money to be awarded, how would you spend the money so that, and then, you know, how many positions, what would you do, so that it makes it easier then to write the story around the budget rather than having someone completely different writing a budget that makes no sense. Other reasons relative to the budget is that people put in things in the budget that has absolutely nothing to do with the work, and you have reviewers that can spot that. And it can be a few points that they take off, and those few points could make the difference between you winning and losing. So some of the things that I would offer in terms of tips to make your proposal stand out, whenever I write a federal proposal, I always use the same font size and margin. And in fact, I always suggest that groups just get in a habit of doing that always, just so that if you end up cutting and pasting from other proposals, you don't have to worry about changing any of that. I always start with an outline that mirrors the instructions in the solicitation, and then I back into it. I would be conscious about the use of bullets in a federal proposal. Bullets can be tempting, and I'm not saying bullets are a bad thing, but if you're going past, say, 4 bullets, usually you would be better off turn those bullets into a sentence and then ultimately into a paragraph, rather than having a line and then a bunch of bullets, a line and a bunch of bullets. Usually that's just a sign that a person is not comfortable with the writing. So just watch the use of bullets. So again, I'm not saying don't use bullets, but if you have a lot of bullets like on every page, that's way too much. Always use headers and footers. in your, to indicate the name of the organization, the name of the agency, and, if there's a solicitation number, to include that so it shows up on every page. Definitely page numbering. You want to be conscious of the page limit and what they're asking for within that page limit. If they don't ask for something, don't give it. Cover letters, table of contents, if they don't want it, all you're doing is you're eating into your page count, and no one's going to score that. The other thing is that I said earlier about making your proposals pleasing. Because you have to upload everything, nowadays it's only in a couple of files, you want to make sure all the resumes and job descriptions that you have are uniform. So everyone in your organization should have a 2-page or less resume. Same font, same format. No personal information. No one cares about your zodiac sign, if you have a pet or your hobby, or your future aspirations. They want a resume that is reflective of the work that you do now, and so giving everyone that template for people to complete in a Word format allows you to keep track of every resume so that you have it at your disposal, and you're not hunting for them at the last minute. And I mentioned earlier about understanding the difference between letters of commitment versus letters of support. Your goal is to get letters of commitment. Sometimes you're going to get more than what you need, and that's okay, because federal agencies will typically put a cap on the number of pages for attachments. So they'll limit the number of pages for the narrative, and then they also limit the number of pages for attachments. And so sometimes you're going to find that they're going to ask for resumes, job descriptions, letters of commitments or MOUs, all in the org charts and logic models, all in the context of the attachments. And so you have to kind of weigh what's most important. And so if they ask for it in the narrative, that automatically gives you an indication of this is what I have to have. And then if you find that you have extra pages, you can, add more letters if you want. I personally am not a fan of putting in a lot of pictures and things like that, unless it's kind of a graphic to depict something. But for the most part, this is what makes your proposal stand out. When a reviewer can look at everything and it looks the same, it's clean, and they don't have to hunt for information. Your headings in the proposal itself are the exact same headings in their solicitation. It makes life so much easier, particularly if you're going to an agency where you've not gone before. So how are you then notified? So you've done your research, you developed a relationship, you've written the right proposal. How are you notified? What do you do if the amount has been changed? And what do you do if your application is not funded? So typically on a federal award, sometimes they may start sending you communication asking for clarification. Generally, they will send notification to your senator's office to advise them, and then obviously they will notify your executive director. Sometimes there will be discussions around the amount of the award, issues that they had with the budget and all of that. But here's the most important piece. If your application is not funded, it is important that you request your scores. They have an obligation to give you your scores, and the letter that they send will give you a lot of information about what they liked or didn't like about your proposal that you can use in the future. So don't just get upset about it. Get ready for the next solicitation by asking for your scores. And believe it or not, sometimes they actually make mistakes. So you want to read your scores and the comments that they've offered carefully to see, in fact, if they've made any mistakes. So again, it takes usually about 120 days. And as I said, they send it out to the political representatives. If you have been declined, sometimes it can take longer to receive those notifications. If you have been declined, if you have an opportunity to go to Washington, or if you're in Chicago, if there's someone out of the regional office, I always encourage groups to request a debriefing session. That's where they literally will sit face-to-face with you and talk about your scores. One is a way to help you to begin developing a relationship with an agency that maybe you've not had before. So don't get too down again about not winning. Use it as an opportunity to kind of form a relationship. So I have covered a lot that we have. I want to kind of stop and see if there are any other questions that folks may have about what I've covered. And then just to kind of hear from you in terms of what are some of the things you might do to position your organization for some other opportunities. And so you can do it by chat, or I guess we can take the mute off.
Hey, Alyson, this is Elizabeth again. So we don't have any questions in the chat box at the moment.
Okay. Okay. Well, you know, I've covered a lot. I will say that there are tremendous opportunities. We're coming to the end of this year, but you know, if you have some time that you can spend looking at opportunities for next year, you can be in a great position so that when those opportunities are formally announced, you'll be ready to go. But I would say, you know, I encourage people, if you have questions after today, you can email me, you can give me a call. I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But remember, for pursuing federal grants, and quite frankly, it still applies to state and city, it ultimately comes down to, can you follow directions? How crazy those directions might be, but can you follow directions, and can you find information about the opportunity in enough time so that you can put together a quality proposal? And so with that, if no one has any other questions, I've given you my contact information. Oops, I don't know, I hear something in the background.
Yes, hi, Alyson, this is Elizabeth. So we have a question from Jacqueline. How long will it take for a new organization to do a federal proposal?
So a little trick, when you pull down a federal solicitation, somewhere in the back of the solicitation, they actually have calculated the amount of time they estimate it will take. And so it will literally be somewhere near the last 2 pages. And it'll say 40 hours, 80 hours. It really depends on the agency, but typically, and that's the range. Typically, it's going to take somewhere between 40 and 80 hours. If you've never responded to something, it's probably going to be higher because the amount of detail that they're going to be looking for is much more than you would see for a, like, say, for example, a foundation grant. But the beauty of it is that once you do it, you will have information that you can then use and cut down for foundation grants. So it can be time-consuming on the front end, but it's a good investment, particularly for a program that you're looking at rolling out and seeking funding from both public and private sources. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are looking at hiring a grant writer, an external grant writer, that the federal proposal, federal government and state, they prohibit you from using the grant itself to pay the grant writer. And so they will put in language that says, you know, no cost of the preparation of the application can be recovered through this grant. And basically that says you can't use the money to pay the grant writer. Now, whether you write the grant writer into the proposal in a different capacity, you know, that's your call. But, and if you have grant writers that are offering to write on commission or contingency, that's actually considered unethical by most grant writing associations. So you really kind of want to stay clear of that as well. Any other questions? Well, it has been my pleasure to hopefully share some, tidbits with you today. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Take advantage of looking at grants.gov for some of the opportunities that are out there that I think many of you will be eligible to apply for. And remember, if it turns out that you may not be the ideal person to be the lead, it could be a question of finding not person or organization, but it could be that it's about pulling together the right team to go after the opportunity. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Claudette. And I guess I really have to turn it back over.
Okay. Thanks, Alyson, and thanks, everyone, for participating. You should see at the bottom of your screen now that there is a link to complete the evaluation form. We ask that you complete that at your earliest convenience. And if you do not have it or if you have difficulty with it, we certainly can email it to you. Just to let you know, please continue to check your email and the All Chicago newsletter for other learning opportunities that will be offered through the Learning Center. And again, we want to thank Alyson for her presentation today. Alyson, one of the comments from the participants is this is one of the best presentations they've heard. So thank you very much. And thanks all, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.